So what explains this in terms of self-identification, where, I think the most recent statistic shows that 44% of women under 30 identify as liberal compared with only 25% of young men, and this is the largest gender gap on record in terms of sort of self-identified political orientation. And it's sort of at odds with what we're seeing in the broader culture, other statistics showing that women have surpassed men in education. Women are the majority of bachelor's, master's, and now PhDs. In many metropolitan cities, women are rivaling or even out-earning their male peers, specifically people under 30. And so as they achieve educational parity, income parity, people might expect, well, then their political views will become more aligned. Their self-interests will be more similar, men and women's self-interest. And this is not what we see. Instead,
Welcome back to the City Journal podcast. I'm your host, Charles Fain Lehman, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, senior editor of City Journal. Joining me on the panel today are John Ketcham, responsible for all things cities at the Manhattan Institute, Jesse Arm, whose ever-changing title includes an increasing number of external affairs at the Manhattan Institute, and Rob Henderson, who regales us with his cultural wisdom at the Manhattan Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the show. I want to draw attention to sort of a little discussed story. It got dropped in the Friday news dump. Nobody was going to pay attention to it. We want to pay attention to it at City Journal. This is a little policy wonk in the weeds, but I think it's an important one. On Friday, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker signed a deal to add $11 billion to Chicago's fire and police pensions. He previously said he was evaluating the deal. Now he's added new pension liabilities to what is arguably the most dysfunctional pension system in the nation. It will slap down on Chicago taxpayers and Illinois taxpayers. It's also an interesting move given Pritzker's aspirations for the White House. It's also an interesting move given, again, just like how deeply in debt Illinois is. So I want to talk about this story. A is sort of a story about what it looks like when public sector unions control an entire state, and then B, how this fits into the politics of the moment, and sort of the Pritzker lane in the 2028 primary. If there's a Pritzker lane in the 2028 primary, what the heck that stands for? We'll get into all that. So let me throw it to the panel. What did you make of this story?
I think it's basically what political surrender looks like. It's, a stroke of a pen, and J.B. Pritzker suddenly adds $11 billion in unfunded liabilities to the worst funded pension system in the country in Chicago's police and fire. So you've got these funds that are now projected, I think, to fall below 20% funded. That means the city is facing a $1.2 billion deficit while its schools are teetering on insolvency, and the transit system is circling the drain. And the governor's response is to dig the hole deeper. So I don't know. I see the short-term beneficiaries of a move like that as obviously the public sector unions, which of course make no inherent sense to begin with. If we're being honest, they're a political machine embedded within the state itself. And the long-term losers are obviously going to be the Chicago taxpayers.
So if we put it in perspective, Chicago's pension debt is about $37 billion. Now, that's more than 43 states, and 7 out of the 10 worst funded pension systems in the nation are in Chicago. Big picture problem here is also that Illinois is in a much weaker fiscal position than New York State. And New York spends a lot less than Illinois on its public pensions for state employees. So Illinois spends about 10.5% of the state operating budget on pension expenditures. That's a lot higher than New York's roughly 3.5%. So Illinois' per capita debt burden is about $19,500, and New York's is only about $12,000. That means that Chicago is going to have a much harder time getting itself out of this mess with state assistance. It's making a bad problem way worse.
Part of what's interesting to me, and I want to zoom out from this, but it's just sort of like Chicago is always fascinating to me because it's a great example of a city whose problems appear to be like largely self-imposed. Where it's the third largest city in the United. I forget it's second or third largest city in the United States. I forget. It's like tussling with Los Angeles. I think it's the third largest city in the United States. That like has a great deal of productive capital. There are businesses there. Sure, it's like major business dried up when we stopped using canals, but like, okay, you can still get a great deal just from the concentration of human capital there. And they've just like squandered it at every available opportunity. They've hiked taxes, they've gone after their businesses, those have fled, and they instead say, okay, how can we put more money into the pockets of the public sector unions? How can we like take from the rich and give to entrenched interests and like the clients who run the political machine? Which again, I mean, I always think of things in the context of like the sort of root causes critique. It's like, is Chicago's problem, I don't know, racism, poverty, or deprivation? Like, no, Chicago's fundamental problem is that they choose poor governance and they're sort of stuck in this destructive, self-destructive cycle of we're going to continue to funnel money to like our entrenched interests and away from what we think is good governance, or what I would think of as good governance.
All of that sounds right, except I would only take quibble with the taking from the rich part because you're actually just taking from the public coffers, which end up disproportionately benefiting the pool. I mean, yeah, like people's buses aren't going to run on time. I don't know. I think this decision, you have to think of it as something that was driven pretty much exclusively by politics from Pritzker's perspective. Even a far left progressive like the rotund Illinois governor understands the calamitous policy implications of what he's just done. Pritzker is auditioning for something different, though, and that's a 2028 presidential run. And this was a love letter to organized labor. He wants to do something that he knows can better position himself for union endorsements and leave Chicago holding the bag. And the next round of Me Too demands that are going to come from the teachers' unions, from the state university workers, and various other local public employee bargaining units, that'll come. That'll come fast and hard. And I don't know. I view this as basically a preemptive surrender to this wave of copycat demands that will, or very well could, drive his state, Illinois, into fiscal collapse.
I should note that these pressures are, you know, they disincentivize good government across the United States, right? So elected leaders in big cities have similar pressures from public sector workers. They always want to spend more money on things that will make them look good, right? They have a strong incentive to promise more generous pensions instead of higher pay now, because the pensions are deferred compensation, so they can promise more later without having to make the hard trade-offs today. But then, of course, those pensions are rarely funded adequately, especially given the lower than expected birth rate. So these systems are just chronically underfunded, and then they'll eventually just become insolvent. But um, the ones who are overseeing the pension boards are also partly to blame here because they are using pension funds for reasons other than ensuring that retirees get a good return sufficient for their pensions. So, for example, in New York City, the comptroller Brad Lander, who oversees the pension system here, he's put pension money into things like affordable housing developments, which by definition, they are not viable investments from a market perspective, right? So essentially, that means that you are subsidizing housing developments for some group of people at the expense of pensioners. And eventually the taxpayer has to make up any shortfall. The taxpayer in New York is constitutionally guaranteed to backfill any public pension liabilities for government workers. And so that creates a moral hazard on the behalf of those who are managing these pension systems to score political points, ultimately at the expense of the pensioners and the taxpayers.
I want to yeah, and but I should plug. We had a great piece from Alison Schrager, I think last week, the week before, about Brad Lander's management of his of New York City in his capacity as city controller, which is obviously, he may end up first deputy mayor of New York. So that was highly timely. How he's done. But point B, I want to return to Jesse's point about like Pritzker wants to be president. He wants to run president in 2028. This has been obvious for a long time. I think, if there had been a real primary in 24, he might have run in that rather than the field being cleared for Kamala Harris. So he clearly has aspirations. I think there's an interesting question of like, is this kind of strategy? I'm not sure we get Robin here. I'm curious of John's take as well on the politics side of this. Just is one of the major themes we've come back to over and over again on the show is the sort of like DSAification of democratic politics and the shift in that direction. Pritzker is sort of weird. He is, as Jesse alluded to, a progressive, but he doesn't sort of like wear his class war on his sleeve, which would be hard because he's from an extremely wealthy family. Um, you can't really fit into the DSA lane. So, I'm curious more broadly, is there room in the party for somebody like an ultra wealthy, sort of technocratic, sort of kleptocratic governor of Illinois to run for president, or is that a complete non-starter? I mean, state governors of all of the two-thirds of the Democratic presidents since Lyndon Johnson have been state governors, but they're both weird, so I'm not sure that can generalize. That's a small sample. No, sorry, half of that. I forgot Joe Biden was president. Sorry, that was that. Yeah, J.B. Pritzker running for president. Thoughts, Jesse?
Well, I was going to give other folks an opportunity to jump in, but I'll say, yeah, of course. I mean, Pritzker, I disagree with you. Pritzker is from the same radical part of the Democratic Party as all of the other people that were frequently kind of freaking out about the AOC wing. You're only saying he's not because he's wealthy and white and like large physically and in terms of kind of personality and reputation. But if you look down the kind of checkbox of all of the policies he's endorsed and the people he's aligned himself with, he is a fan of the far left, and that is the lane that he will play for in 2028. But for the fact that you still kind of qualify him and you're getting onto something here as something less than the farthest left wing, and that I think will be his hangup, right? Because he's playing for far left votes, but he's doing so as a kind of billionaire white guy. It's not going to play. It's not going to work. He doesn't have much of a record to run on. The metrics on Illinois don't suggest a clear record of success under the Pritzker tenure. So I'm skeptical that he takes this 2028 presidential run past Iowa or I don't even know what the Democrats are having their first primary contest in anymore. They've played so many hijinks with that. But I'm very skeptical of a Pritzker run because of precisely that reason.
He's trying to position himself as a business leader and an anti-Trump political leader, but if you look at his actual record on both, he comes up pretty short. He did not create the Hyatt Hotel Company himself. He inherited it from his grandparents. So, it's largely a matter of inherited wealth. And I don't have any problem with that. But if you're trying to craft this aura around you of business success, well, people, I hope, would get privy to that and scrutinize the substance. And then just on the political leadership, well, as Jesse mentioned, Chicago public schools are among the best funded in the nation, and they are among the worst performing in many cases in the nation. Illinois has an incredible fiscal challenge ahead of it. In many cases, it's a paradigmatic example of governing failure than anything else. And he'll ultimately have to answer for that unless the political dynamic is such that you can oppose Trump, and whoever does so the loudest and the most stridently gets the best chance of winning.
All right. I want to take us out. So I'm going to start the exit question with Rob because before he was like, you bring me out to talk these wonky things, and I feel like I'm not a wonk. So sorry, but no. So I want to ask the question for the panel before we go is what I mean. Going back to the pensions issue, is there a way to get voters to care about this? Is there a way to get the American public to care about this? Because it's like an intrinsically wonky topic. It's hard to get people to sort of be invested in like pension solvency. Like John and I care about it, but normal people don't. So like is there a way to highlight the seriousness of this as an issue, or are we stuck to sort of like pointing at the numbers and hoping that somebody cares? That's a question for everybody. I'll start with Rob.
Well, what immediately comes to mind, as someone who studied psychology, is many of the listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate, he tells this anecdote about how no one cares about numbers. Number is just scribbling on a piece of paper or some pixels on a screen. People care about stories, and so I wonder if you could tell a story, if high-profile politicians tell a story of what happens when someone loses their pension or if we become insolvent. And that might get people thinking. But if we just talk about numbers, I don't think anyone is really going to take much interest in it.
Fair. John?
The pension debt bomb has a fuse that's lit, and it's somewhere in the future. It'll catch up to the charge, but nobody really knows when exactly that is. I mean, it could be as soon as the next recession. But if you look at Detroit, Detroit underwent a bankruptcy. The court had to step in and restructure the city's obligations. Pensioners had to take a haircut. But the city right now is on a much firmer footing. It is experiencing something of a comeback. And so, does it have to get to the point of municipal bankruptcy for people to care? It might, but at least there is a silver lining in a real life case study of a major city that did go belly up is coming back.
Can look for Detroit as an exemplar of. No, we actually we had a mag piece from Judy Miller, which I think ran last weekend about the turnaround of Detroit, which is notable.
No Detroit slander. Detroit is cool. Detroit is my hometown, and anybody who wants to go can ask for recommendations, and I'll point you in the right direction. Can we get
in
people?
the weird pizza?
Oh yeah, we've already done. I feel like we've done a podcast segment on
Depressing.
Detroit style pizza. It's objectively the best. Although it didn't really take off until more recent years, and then I don't remember growing up and Detroit pizza being definitively a thing. Then it just became like a trendy thing. When I was living in New York, I was like, oh, that's just good pizza.
I've never heard of Detroit pizza before this podcast. Seriously,
you do it in like a square. You do it in like a baking tin. Basically, it's weird.
What?
You ever
So
been
is
to
it a
any
thick
square
crust
in New York, Rob?
Yes.
No, I have. It's a thick crust. Oh, I'm not a huge fan of the thick crust. I think I'm out. I'll try it, but I'm.
It's got the buttery crust. It's got the buttery crust. It's very good, and you put a little ranch dressing on there, and it's just perfect. That's the real Midwestern embrace. Can we get people to care about pensions?
No, I got to say, it's pretty interesting that our cultural critic, our man of culture, doesn't know about Detroit pizza. It just goes to show you that.
I knew. Yeah, you were going to say Chicago. I know Chicago pizza, but never heard of Detroit pizza.
Similar but different.
Nomer.
Okay, Detroit pizza. Because Detroit now has such a horrible reputation, that almost sounds like it could be like a meme or a neologism. Detroit pizza, things are getting so bad. This is like Detroit pizza. Yeah.
You got to settle for Detroit pizza,
yeah, exactly.
Pensions.
Yeah. Oh yeah, pensions.
It's okay.
I'll get the pension.
I started it.
It does sound like something a marketing or PR firm in Woodward Avenue, Royal Oak, Michigan, just outside of town, might have come up with as a way to sell Detroit, possibly. But yes, can we get people to care about pensions? I would say probably not. Certainly, if we're referring to it as pension reform, the best bet though for how you get people to care about an issue like this, I think, is if you explain it in the terms of the implications of not doing anything about it, right? It's why your taxes are going up. It's why the buses aren't running. It's why your kids' schools are failing. Yeah, maybe then you get voters to start to care. There's a reason, I think, that voters tend to trust the GOP more than Democrats on the economy and fiscal responsibility, even if voters can't necessarily perfectly articulate why that is themselves. They live it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is that it's hard to get people to care about pensions, but it is easy to get people to care about municipal bankruptcy when it actually happens. That is a very scary disciplining event, right? It is possible to tell people stories about what it looks like when a city goes bankrupt. It's not pretty. So, I think that is some point of leverage, although you do have to have the experience in order for it to happen. All right, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit. Let's move away from pensions and talk about sex, which is a much better topic for getting listeners. We should have started with sex. Sex always sells. We have Rob on the show. I said to him before we started, I was like, I'm not going to just bring you on the show to talk about your MAG article, but I really liked his article in the magazine, so I wanted to talk about this because it's a bigger theme that we've touched on a couple of different times, which is sort of the rising political divide between men and women and its underlying causes and what he refers to as persistent psychological and behavioral sex differences that continue to shape how each group sees the world. And then much of the article is dedicated to reviewing the literature on those persistent differences. So I wanted to, start the conversation with Rob, but then draw everyone into sort of discussion of like how what is driving these rising sex differences. And Rob, I wonder if you could talk very briefly about sort of how you see underlying evolved capacities driving the current split that we're seeing in the sexes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I wrote this long form piece in an attempt to explore and understand what's happening here. So many people are aware that there's been this growing gender divide in politics where women are veering very sharply to the left, men are going slightly to the right. So I'm not talking necessarily about voting patterns. So the voting patterns were clear that young men turned out for Trump and even young women. I mean, they overwhelmingly went for Harris, but there was a slight shift from relative to 2020 and 2024. Even young women, a larger percentage of them went for Trump. Although they did go overwhelmingly for Harris overall. So what explains this in terms of self-identification, where, I think the most recent statistic shows that 44% of women under 30 identify as liberal compared with only 25% of young men. And this is the largest gender gap on record in terms of sort of self-identified political orientation. It's sort of at odds with what we're seeing in the broader culture, other statistics showing that women have surpassed men in education. Women are the majority of bachelor's, master's, and now PhDs. In many metropolitan cities, women are rivaling or even out-earning their male peers, specifically people under 30. And so as they achieve educational parity, income parity, people might expect, well, then their political views will become more aligned. Their self-interests will be more similar, men and women's self-interest. And this is not what we see. Instead, it's growing. And so, I dug into the research, discussing this very interesting finding that came out when I was in grad school at the University of Cambridge. There were several papers on this, and by now it's more or less an established fact. It's called the gender equality paradox, which is this finding that in societies that are more prosperous and sociopolitically equal, the gender gap in various traits actually grows rather than shrinks. So if you look at Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden, you'll find that men and women are actually more different from one another than in more traditional societies like Vietnam or Botswana. And this is true for physical traits, interestingly, where the height gap between men and women. So men tend to be taller on average than women, but that gap is actually larger in richer and more sociopolitically equal societies. This is true for BMI. It's true for blood pressure. So the physical findings are interesting on their own, but then there's also a larger gap in more equal societies with regard to personality traits. So what psychologists call the big five: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, sometimes referred to as emotional stability. So in these traits,
it wasn't neuroticism in the piece. It was. I was like, it's ocean. It's OCEAN. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, there's been this shift. I mean, it depends on the paper that you read. So sometimes psychologists will refer to that trait as neuroticism, but then other psychologists will reverse score it or reverse code it, and now it's referred to as emotional stability, which is basically neuroticism, but the opposite. So the higher you score in neuroticism, the more sensitive you are to negative emotion, and then emotional stability is basically how robust you are to setbacks in life, your emotional stability. And so across these traits, men and women differ. Some of those traits higher than others. So for agreeableness, for example, which captures traits like compassion and empathy and regard for others, especially people who are perceived as vulnerable or disadvantaged, women score much higher than men on this trait, especially in more sociopolitically equal, prosperous societies, places like Scandinavia, places like Western Europe, places like the United States. And I suggest that, as societies actually become, as they achieve their goals, becoming richer, becoming more equal, treating people increasingly more fairly, men and women are actually growing further apart on these traits, and that this fuels, in part, the growing political divide.
Yeah, we've talked with I think a little bit before in the show, and I'm a big believer in sort of this. It's a political scientist Ron Engelhardt, but lots of other people like this too. This idea of post-materialism, which is like starting in the 1970s, material constraints become less relevant to politics, and so we become more invested in effective issues and issues of justice, in things that are not just bread and butter issues, in the sense of like making sure that we get enough calories or our children get enough calories, and that men and women are going to vary on how they regard those issues in a way that they don't necessarily on like core issues of how to get enough food to feed your family. And so that I think has explained a lot of that variation. Has explained a lot of variation in a number of different traits. But I want to kick to the rest of the panel sort of for thoughts and responses on the rising gender gap in politics. I mean, do you find the biological explanation persuasive? Do you think there are other factors which you think about? What do we make of it?
Well,
Well,
so okay, so just to be clear, it's not entirely biological. So I'm saying that there are material conditions involved, right? Like as societies become more wealthy, then you're going to see these biological traits diverge even further apart. So
Yeah.
one thing that really clicked for me when I was sort of reading Rob's piece, it reminded me of a lot of stuff that I've picked up through Nate Silver, the pollster or polling aggregator, his recent writing about gender and politics. Um, I think, how personality traits like agreeableness and neuroticism, both of which skew higher in women, they don't necessarily just shape political attitudes, but they shape political tone. And Silver has made this point well. A lot of young men aren't necessarily turned off by policies associated with the Democratic Party so much as like an overall vibe. The left feels very anxious, rules obsessed, overly therapeutic. And it's not that these guys are the young voters who are becoming more Republican. It's not that they're necessarily angry or broken, like the picture we see painted of a lot of them who are angry and broken and maybe are disproportionately representative on platforms like Twitter. It's that they don't see themselves in a culture that increasingly pathologizes risk and competition. So when Rob points out that psychological sex differences widen in freer societies, you start to understand why this divide is growing rather than shrinking. And if anything, more freedom just lets people lean harder into their default wiring. And politically, I do think that's showing up as a sharp gender split.
I had a conversation a couple months ago with a notable left-leaning commentator, let's put it that way, who said to me something to the effect of like, look, this person is male and prone to disagreeableness and prone to argumentation. He was like, many people who look like me are just sort of alienated from a large portion of the Democratic Party, and that is a gendered thing. It's just like I don't argue like a woman, and women don't like it when I argue with them in democratic spaces, and democratic spaces are increasingly run by women, which is hostile to somebody who makes arguments like me. And I was like, yeah, I'm not a Democrat, so I don't have that problem, but I understand your argument. Sorry, John, I cut you off.
No, so I agree with Rob's evolutionary and biological assessment, but I started thinking a lot about culture while reading his piece. Culture is to a great extent the means by which groups of people channel these sexual differences, right? Shifting reproductive success to traits other than those prized by natural selection. So instead of physical strength and size, for example, it becomes things like wealth and education. And it got me thinking about the differences in marriage. So in societies that allow for polygamy, there's greater competition for females because a few relatively high status males uh, can have greater reproductive success with multiple females. And so to limit this competition from spilling over into violence, women are often veiled or secluded because the males still have to get on with each other in society. Whereas monogamous marriage is a way of starting off with lower male versus male competition for females because you create a more even distribution of mating opportunities for males. And then they have, males essentially trade the preference that they have for more than one female partner for greater reproductive certainty, right? And it channels each man's energies into his family rather than to search for a mate that's in shorter supply than in a polygamous situation. And so it facilitates social stability and productivity. It also reminded me of the political process insofar as it replaces violence with institutions that make cooperation among people more durable and more assured. We give up being the judge in our own cause and using violence to advance our means in a political society in the same way or in a similar way as we do with monogamous marriage. We can take just one partner and we can have protection against the greater risk of a polygamous society. So I think it's not surprising that in a society where monogamous marriage has eroded and has weakened, you're going to see more males losing from male-male competition. And I think that has some big implications in society. It's not surprising that younger men are looking, to reinforce marriage through socially conservative norms. They want to restore marriage because it does help them have a greater chance of being an integrated part of society. We need the institutions though to support marriage. We used to have a code of chivalry. Now we have a code of consent. But Edmund Burke was very wise in saying that the restraints on our passion are to be counted on our liberties, are to be counted as our rights. So our restraints and our liberties and our passions are to be counted among our rights.
There's an interesting point there, because you have seen, conversely to the point about young men wanting more marriage, you have seen a rise of sort of influencers, people influential over a certain sect of young men who are actively opposed to monogamy. I'm thinking of people like Andrew Tate or Myron Gaines, who have a number of loathsome opinions, among them being like open hostility to monogamy. And it's interesting that that goes hand in hand with and I think this is a word that some people throw around freely. I don't throw around freely, but like just open misogyny, just like women are vile and terrible and deserve often physical abuse is their thesis. Uh, and to John's point, but also to Rod's point, you can see a connection between these two things. It's like once you start from the premise of uh, we just need to accept that men and women are always going to be opposed to each other, and that the sort of the ways in which they view the world differently are a necessary source of conflict rather than we can build institutions that resolve that conflict and allow them to coexist, you're going to end up with like this fairly dysfunctional way of thinking about the world that you can then proselytize to other people. I am curious about that sort of question about
Yeah.
how do you deal with these intrinsic tensions?
Well, I mean, it is interesting that across multiple societies throughout history, they have independently developed the concept of marriage. Societies that have no contact with one another, thousands of miles and centuries apart, continue to sort of organically develop this idea of, well, maybe we should codify this relationship in order to promote societal stability and productivity and so on. To John's earlier point. And there's a really interesting researcher. I think her name is Alice Evans. She talks about this. This may also be a contributing factor to the growing political divide. Is the fact that people are single now. When you spend a lot of time with the opposite sex, your views tend to de-radicalize over time because you start to see the other person's perspective, what their concerns are, what they care about, what their priorities are, and you have a bit of empathy for them, and then them for you. And this tends to soften people's political views and prevent them from veering into extremism. But if you are an angry young person and you spend a lot of time with other angry young person of your own sex, and you tend to reflect your ideas off of one another, they tend to polarize, they tend to harden, and then sort of fuels the disagreement.
You man hating, woman hating. All right, I can talk about this all day, but we should try to stay on time. So I'll take us out and ask the panel: do we think that there is do we think it's plausible that this gap will close? You've seen this gap between the sexes open across several democracies. It's more pronounced in some places than others. South Korea is really bad. We're doing okay by comparison. But do we think that this is this just the state of play, or is there a way to get this gap to close again? Jesse, what's your take?
Not unless the left becomes more comfortable with testosterone and less
Men.
allergic to discomfort. I don't see it closing in the near term because it will require sort of a major corrective on the left, which I think we're further than 4 years away from.
John?
I don't see it for some time at least. It's gonna take a while. I mean, it reminds me also that for the first time practically ever, young men are more religious than young women. And
Hmm.
for similar reasons, I think that Rob highlights. Traditional religion offers structure, it offers well-defined roles, and I think young men find that quite reassuring and quite the juxtaposition in contrast against the far left. So I see these trends persisting.
That's interesting, John, because I've seen that as well. That young men are tilting more towards the religious side, and this is relatively new. Women have always been more religious than men, but I guess this supports the idea that politics has replaced religion for a lot of young people. Because when you look at who's the most politically involved and who care the most and post the most about politics, actually young women, more so than young men. So they've pivoted over to politics and away from religion. But yeah, as for the question, Charles, I would say same answer as Jesse and John. Not anytime soon. I worry about other technological advances, AI boyfriends, AI girlfriends, all this stuff. I think it's yeah, there's not going to be this reconciliation, at least not anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument in the other direction, I'm not sure I buy it. It's just that like it is unsustainable to so aggressively alienate one sex, and this is the argument with Democrats. You can make this argument with Republicans. You can make this argument across the developed world. But it is, it's hard to have a coalition that's only composed of one sex. I mean, they do end up being half the population, so you can count to 50% with them, but like it is relatively unsustainable. So at some point you have to moderate in the other direction. I think that is the argument. I'm not sure I buy it, but that's the argument.
I will say there's like maybe this is an optimistic view, is that we're a multi-ethnic democracy, but we're polarized increasingly on gender lines. Whereas in a lot of other multi-ethnic democracies, their political parties are explicitly organized along sort of ethnic and racial affiliation, and we're kind of like South Korea, which is a homogenous society, where like they're polarized along gender lines too. So in a way, it kind of gives me hope that all right, we'll focus on gender and away from the kind of racial conflict we see in a lot of other societies.
It's a strange kind of hope.
I just want to say
All right.
to our listeners, you should read Rob's piece. It really is an outstanding work of writing and of analysis. Very so well crafted.
It's on the website. It's up. You can go check it out. Citizenjournal.org.
Thanks,
All right,
guys.
before we go, somehow we can't go a week without talking about Sydney Sweeney. I thought we were done with Sydney Sweeney last week, but we were not done with Sydney Sweeney. It turns out, I think BuzzFeed unearthed this first, and then a friend of the New York Post and Page Six picked it up. Everybody has it now. The president has asked about it. Apparently, she's a registered Republican. So before we go, people's responses to this: are you shocked, surprised, etc.?
But
Jesse
wait,
had a pitch. Jesse had a
We
pitch with
got
me about Sydney Sweeney.
Charles. We have breaking news coming across the City Journal podcast transom here. The president has weighed in further.
Yeah.
I'm going to read his latest post to
It's
Truth
truth.
Social. Sydney Sweeney, spelled incorrectly with an I. Sydney
That's
Sweeney.
how it's spelled now. If he spells it that way, that's how it's spelled. He's the president.
You're right. That was wrong of me. Sydney Sweeney, a registered Republican, has the hottest, all caps, ad out there. It's for American Eagle, and the jeans are, quote, flying off the shelves. Go get 'em, Sydney. On the other... Wow, there were just balloons that went on my screen. Did anybody see that? I don't know how we did that.
Those were helium filled.
I'm going to keep reading. On the other side of the ledger, Jaguar did a stupid woke advertisement that is a disaster. The CEO just resigned. The company is in turmoil. Shouldn't they have learned a lesson from Bud Light, which went woke and essentially destroyed in a short but very woke campaign the company? The market cap destruction has been unprecedented. Billions of dollars lost. Or just look at woke singer Taylor Swift. Ever since I alerted the world as to what she was by saying on Truth, that I can't stand her.
Okay, discuss.
Wordsmith.
Sydney Sweeney is a Republican. The president is on her side. What do we make of this? Let me throw it to the. I guess I have to ask people the exit. Rob.
Well, I think people are unsurprised by this. It was reported months ago or last year that she has Republican family members. She doesn't seem to be especially outspoken about politics. Someone dug up this tweet of hers from 2020 where she did something about hashtag Black Lives Matter, but everyone was doing that in 2020, or everyone who, a lot of people anyway.
It wasn't on a Sisters podcast.
Yeah. And except us. Well, and so yeah, unsurprising. And the fact that she did this ad, I heard a rumor, and I have not verified this, that she's a listener of the Red Scare podcast. So when that news came out, I was not surprised.
Fair. John?
I think I know the reason why. Florida is obviously a Republican state, and it's also a closed primary state. And so she wants to be registered with the party to participate in the only election that matters.
It's because she's a savvy political consumer. Okay, Jesse.
Oh man, well, I've wanted to talk about this for a while, and I was sad I missed the podcast the other day where you guys discussed it at greater length. But I think this isn't shocking at all, and that's exactly why it's so triggering to people. Sydney Sweeney has always radiated this kind of effortless, unbothered, normie energy that makes today's cultural scolds lose their minds. She's hot in like a normal, not overwhelming way. She's giving more girl next door than the like massive supermodel, and she's not interested in moralizing and doesn't need to apologize for any of it. And that's, I believe, what drove the hysteria over the American Eagle ad, that it wasn't the soft voice or the jeans talk. It was that she's been playing it completely straight with no woke hashtags or trauma monologues or lecturing, with just beauty, charisma, and like this unapologetic mass appeal. And then, yeah, now we see that she's a registered Republican in Florida. No one, I don't think, is so surprised. It's more of a confirmation that Sydney Sweeney never really bought into the values of elite cultural progressivism, where being attractive is only fine if you're also performatively ashamed of it. Like, people like Emily Ratajkowski have to get out there and campaign for Zoran in order to also be like hot Hollywood starlets. So yeah, I don't think Sydney Sweeney's MAGA, and she's not bending the knee either. And that like refusal to do the self-flagellation game, combined with her massive success, is what makes her feel dangerous to these woke people. She's not playing their game, and she's winning without even acknowledging its existence. And in that sense, I don't know. I think like the point is that she's this part of this new generation of female stars. There are others who are part of it. There's kind of like a Sydney Sweeney equivalent that's coded more for women in Sabrina Carpenter out there. I'm of that belief. And I think they all kind of refuse to attach their careers to social justice sermons like the other people that I mentioned, Emily Ratajkowski, Rachel Ziegler, Olivia Rodrigo. They all fit into this. I'm looking at them. But no, you got Sydney Sweeney on the good guy side that's not trying to end wokeness, but also just kind of just being out there, just being unapologetically hot, normal, and commercially successful. They're helping to bury wokeness by doing that. And the people who built their identities around this moral gatekeeping know it. And that's why they're mad.
Hot, normal, and commercially successful is also my goal for the City Journal podcast. On that note, that is about all the time that we have. Thank you, as always, to our panelists. Thank you to our producer, Isabella Regi. Listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell, click the buttons. On Thursday, I've been reminded to tell you, on Thursday, I'll be doing a special one-on-one episode with my colleague, Douglas Murray. We'll be talking about all things Douglas Murray, radicalism, the rise of extremism, domestic violence, etc. I encourage you, particularly if you're interested in that, to click whatever buttons you have to click to make sure that you know that it's going to happen on YouTube or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. Comments, questions, etc. down below. Until next time, you've been listening to the City Journal podcast. We hope you'll join us again soon.